Nick and Daisy had been together for 5 years. After their wedding, they moved into an old apartment that had belonged to Nick's parents. For a while, his folks had rented it out, but eventually they decided to hand it over to their son. Nick worked at a car dealership, while Daisy was an administrator at a private dental clinic. Their relationship had always been steady. No big fights, no dramatic arguments. But as time passed, Daisy started showing new sides of herself, ones Nick hadn't seen before. In the past, she used to say how much she enjoyed her job, how she liked earning her own money instead of just sitting at home. But lately, she kept bringing up how exhausting it was to deal with people all day. Every now and then, she mentioned her friends, women whose husbands could afford to let them quit their jobs, taking full responsibility for the family's income. Nick wasn't blind to what she was getting at, but the reality was he simply couldn't afford to support them both on his salary alone. He had been hoping for a raise and had even spoken to his manager about it recently. The response? "We'll think about it and let you know." The day of his follow-up meeting with his boss finally came. Unfortunately, it didn't go as Nick had hoped. His salary wasn't going to be increased, at least not any time soon. That evening, he came home in a sour mood. He knew he had to break the news to Daisy, and as expected, she didn't take it well. At first, she was downright furious. She had been counting on his promotion, not just to quit her job entirely, but at the very least to improve their standard of living. For the rest of the night, she kept blaming Nick for not pushing hard enough, for not standing his ground. Then, after exhausting herself with complaints, she fell into complete silence. Days passed. Daisy eventually cooled down, but she didn't forget her frustration. One evening, she casually mentioned that she was going to take on extra shifts this month. One of her colleagues was going on vacation, and as she pointed out, she had been wanting to buy a new phone for a while now. This was the perfect chance to earn a little extra. Nick didn't argue. He just nodded, taking in the not-so-subtle message behind her words. "You haven't bought me gifts in a while." It stuck with him. He even started doing the math in his head, how much he'd have to set aside, how long it would take to surprise her with that phone. A month slipped by. Daisy worked longer hours, covering for her absent coworker. Nick often thought about asking if everything was okay with her colleague, but by the time he got home each night, he was too drained to remember. One Saturday morning, he woke up earlier than usual. The bed beside him was empty. Daisy had already left for work. He stretched, shuffled into the kitchen, and was just about to make himself a cup of coffee when his phone rang. It was his best friend, Alex. "Hey, man, you up?" Alex's voice sounded unusually serious. "We need to meet." Nick frowned. Alex never called this early, let alone with that tone. Something was definitely up. They met at a cafe. Nick had just ordered breakfast for himself, having had no time to eat at home. "Remember our buddy Greg?" Alex began, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "He recently decided to get veneers. Not exactly a cheap pleasure, you know." "Well, maybe he can afford it. The guy owns a bunch of hotels, after all," Nick replied, taking a sip of water. "But why the sudden interest? You didn't drag me out here just to talk about someone's new teeth, did you?" He chuckled. Alex hesitated for a second, then leaned in slightly. "The thing is, he went to the clinic where Daisy works, and after his visit, she apparently saved his number and started texting him from her social media account." Nick's brows furrowed. "What are you saying?" "I mean, she was the one who reached out first. Greg, of course, couldn't help but brag. 'Some clinic hottie is hitting on me.' When I heard the name and the place, I put two and two together. Nick's appetite vanished instantly. His stomach twisted, but he kept his voice steady. And what exactly did she write? Alex exhaled. She was openly flirting with him, dropping hints about meeting up. Apparently, they even saw each other once, but according to Greg, it wasn't anything serious, just chatting. Still, it was obvious she had bigger plans. Nick sat there, gripping his fork as if he might snap it in half. Give me his number. That same day, he called Greg and got straight to the point. As it turned out, Daisy had met up with him on one of those so-called extra shifts. Meaning, her co-worker might not have been on vacation at all. She'd had just made up a cover story to sneak off and see other men. Nick took a deep breath, thinking fast. Do me a favor, he said. Ask her out again. But this time, make it clear, it's not just casual small talk. Let her think it's a real date, something with potential. Greg hesitated. Man, I don't know. This is your wife we're talking about. I had no idea. I get it. And trust me, I wish I didn't have to ask. But I need to see this with my own eyes. After a long pause, Greg sighed. All right. If it helps you get the truth, I'm in. The meeting was arranged at a restaurant. Greg arrived first, while Nick waited outside, keeping his phone in hand. The plan was simple. When things got too friendly, Greg would send him a single text. It's time. From the moment she walked in, Daisy was all smiles, laughing at every joke, lightly touching Greg's arm. She leaned in closer, her voice softer, more playful. Then, just as she reached for his hand, Nick's phone buzzed. It was time. He walked in, heading straight for their table. Daisy barely had a second to react before she found herself face to face with her husband. Her fingers were still resting on Greg's hand. How's work going, sweetheart? Nick asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Another one of those field shifts today. Daisy's face turned ghostly pale. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Instead, she lowered her gaze, as if avoiding his eyes would somehow erase what had just happened. Greg cleared his throat and leaned back. I think you've seen enough, he said simply. Nick nodded, then turned to his wife. Get up. We're going home. Daisy flinched, but he didn't raise his voice. I won't touch you. Just pack your things. You're leaving today. She didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. She knew it was over. The aftermath. A week later, Nick stopped by her clinic. He asked to see the director and calmly explained that their administrator had been using the workplace as her personal dating hub. To his surprise, her replacement overheard the conversation and chimed in. Oh, that? Yeah, not the first time, she said, shaking her head. Every time a wealthy client walked in, she made sure to save his number, always trying to find herself a better deal. That was all the director needed to hear. With 2 witnesses confirming her behavior, Daisy was fired on the spot. She managed to rent a small apartment for herself, but without a job, keeping up with rent quickly became impossible. Eventually, she had no choice but to crash with friends while desperately searching for new work. Of course, she still had a list of potential suitors, but as it turned out, none of them were in a hurry to entertain the persistent, now jobless woman. Calls went unanswered, messages were ignored. Her charm had lost its magic. Meanwhile, Nick wasted no time. He filed for divorce, and in the process, walked away with a lesson he wouldn't forget. From that point on, he made sure to thoroughly vet his future partners, no more falling for pretty faces without checking what lay beneath. Luckily, Greg was always more than happy to assist with the screening process.